Right, last one. Question 3. First of all, given the graph of x plus 1 over x minus 3, which is drawn for us, we need to state the asymptotes of the function. With asymptotes, you've got to think about what happens to these sort of functions where you've got where you've got something to do with x at the bottom of a fraction as a denominator of a fraction. So if we take a very simple case, if you just have a look at 1 over x, and we think about what happens to the function as x gets closer and closer to 0. Well, we start off at 2. 1 over 2 is a half. 1 over 1 is 1. 1 over 0.5, well, 0.5 will go into 1 twice, so that'll be 2. 1 over 0.1, well, that's tenth, so it'll go into 1 10 times. 1 over 0.01 will be 100. 1 over 0.001 will be 1,000. So as this bottom number gets closer and closer and closer to 0, the function gets bigger and bigger and bigger. As it approaches 0, 1 divided by 0, effectively you can't plot it. It's undefined. Because it's headed off to infinity, and you can't plot infinity on a graph. So when the denominator is 0, then you get an asymptote. You get a discontinuity in the graph. You can't plot it. It heads off towards infinity. So looking at the function we're actually given, this x plus 1 over x minus 3, what we're saying then is when this denominator is 0, we'll have an asymptote. So it's going to have an asymptote when x minus 3 equals 0, which I can rearrange, and implies that when x equals 3, there'll be an asymptote. So there's my first vertical asymptote, x equals 3. For the horizontal asymptote, what happens horizontally is as x gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, or smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and heads off towards positive and negative infinity, again we have to think about what happens to this function. Well, if you start off thinking about what 1,000 plus 1 divided by 1,000 minus 3 is, 1,001 divided by 997. It's not exactly, but it's roughly 1. And it's pretty much 1,000 over 1,000. It's pretty much 1. And similarly over here, if I did a million plus 1 divided by a million minus 3, well, that's going to be as close to 1 as you want, really, because if it's a million plus 1, the 1's having barely any effect on the million, and the 3's having barely any effect on the million underneath. So you end up with being basically a million divided by a million, which is 1. And as it gets bigger and bigger, as we head towards infinity plus 1 and infinity minus 3, well, 1 and minus 3 are pretty small beer compared to infinity. So it's basically just going to be the top. So in effect, what happens is this 1 and the minus 3, they don't really count when x gets really, really, really big. So we end up with just having x divided by x, whatever this is divided by whatever this is. In this case, x divided by x is 1, so we have a horizontal asymptote of y equals minus 1. There's my two asymptotes, x equals 3 and y equals 1. You can pretty much see that from the graph. I mean, there's a fairly big clue. Even if you didn't sort of know all this stuff, you could look at the graph and say to yourself, well, there's two obvious asymptotes there. You can probably read them off straight from the graph. For B, the second part, it says sketch the graph of minus f1 of x. Now, what's going to go on there then is I've worked out my initial graph, which looks like this. So this is f1 of x. But then after I've worked out all the I've done the stuff to x. I've done this x plus 1 divided by x minus 3, and I've got these y values. But then, because I've made the whole thing negative, because it's minus f1 of x, whatever the y values were, and they're now going to become negative. They're going to change the sign. So if they were positive, they're going to become negative, and if they were negative, they're going to become positive. So that means that here, for example, this was positive. It's now going to become negative. It's going to flip down here. This was negative. It's going to flip up there. So the whole thing gets reflected about the x-axis. Now, if you reflect the whole thing over the x-axis, well, for a start, this asymptote here, y equals 1, is going to get reflected down, and it's now going to be the asymptote y equals minus 1. Obviously, this is going to stay the same. The vertical one's going to stay the same, because reflecting it in the y-axis is going to make no difference whatsoever. But all of this up here is going to get reflected down underneath now, so it's going to be down here. And this here is going to get reflected this way. It will still cross here at the same point, because you know it's not going to, the reflection's not going to change it, so it'll still cross through that point at the same place. And so there's a very, very rough sketch. It's all a bit messy, sorry, because I'm doing it late at night. But anyway, hopefully that gives you a bit more understanding. You can do a better version yourselves. Alright, so that's all 3 parts of it. So hope that was useful. See you tomorrow. Bye.